Today, in 2014, Turner's Travels uniquely comes from my kitchen. This is because on one of the most special days of my life, there was no invention such as a digital camera with a video override. And I'm talking about my wonderful stroke of luck based upon my ingenuity and tenacity that enabled me to meet Nelson Mandela. He is one of the greatest human beings that have ever trod this planet, in the respect that he incarcerated himself to promote the civil rights and living conditions of people of all races in South Africa to be treated with equal respect. And his wife told me that he could have come out of prison years earlier if he agreed terms, but he wouldn't sacrifice his principles. We saw on television in February 1990 Mandela being released from prison, and just by coincidence on the following Friday I was to fly to South Africa to photograph Francis Drake's world voyage, his contact with the South African coastline. On the last but one day of the trip, I was flying from Cape Town back to Johannesburg, and this passenger who'd remained quiet during the flight suddenly spoke to me. This white man said, "You can stay in my home tonight and you can have the services of my black driver called Prince tomorrow, and he'll take you anywhere you want to go on your last day in South Africa." So I asked Prince if he would take me to Nelson Mandela's house in Soweto. It turned out to be a bungalow, frequently visited whilst I was watching by the press. And I went up to the gate and I asked this possibly 15-year-old youth if I could come in because I wanted some teaching materials for my students. And he rightly said Mr. Mandela would be too busy. So I said, "I'll pop over to the car, I've got some booklets I've written for teachers on human rights." He said, "Oh, come on in." And I found myself being the only non-media person in the back garden. I said hello to David Dimbleby from the BBC. In the back garden I saw Mandela on his veranda posing for photographs. As the world's press were clicking away, I couldn't join them because I realised I had to change the film in the camera. So I missed out. Winnie Mandela came out to the back door to release a visitor, and I managed to interview her for 12 minutes. She took me through the bungalow into an outhouse in the backyard. I saw Mandela in a room with dignitaries. I spoke to her for 12 minutes, and I had in my head lots of questions which I had collected during my conversations with drivers as I hitchhiked through South Africa that week. After I interviewed Nelson's wife, Winnie, he came out onto the veranda again, and my camera was ready, and I didn't know I was not supposed to speak. I wasn't a member of the media, and for photo shoots nobody speaks. And I piped up, I said, "Mr. Mandela, please can you look at my camera for a photograph?" And he did, and silence continued. And I then said to him, "Mr. Mandela, you're my hero, please can I have my photograph taken with you?" And the silence continued, and he said, "You've just become my hero, come here." And everybody burst out laughing once Nelson started to laugh at my request. And the laughs continued, and it was a thrilling experience. And the reason the laughs continued was because I said to him as I shook his hand and put my arm around his shoulder, "I salute you, Mr. Nelson Mandela. I'm quoting your words, salute, from your TV address the other day." And he just continued laughing. He was a tall, strong, warm, humorous man. And I didn't know what I'd done at the time. I'd given my camera to a lady photographer, and she photographed me with Nelson Mandela. And his minders hinted that I should step down. And the world's press started to take an interest in me. And I realised I'd become the first tourist in the world to meet Nelson Mandela after his release from prison. And I was thrilled to bits that my picture with him was in the newspaper the next day, but I was in England by the time this picture came out. But the Afrikaans journalist promised me he would send a translated version of the newspaper report, and it reads like this: The Bild, Saturday the 24th February 1990. So I met him on the 12th day of his release, and I've written here, Michael Turner is the first tourist in the world to meet Nelson Mandela after his release from prison. And the newspaper report read as follows: When you ask, you sometimes get, like the Englishman at Mr. Mandela's place yesterday. There was once again a steady stream of visitors to Mr. Mandela's house in Orlando West. Early, the leaders of the Democratic Party had an appointment. Their formal photo session was almost ritual press conference was still underway in the shade of the trees when Reverend Alan Hendrick and his team of Labour Party men arrived for their appointment. They took half an hour. In accordance with the by now established ritual, they appeared with Mr. Mandela on the little veranda for the international press to photograph him. They and Mr. Mandela stood in silence with stiff smiles, wanting the press to get through taking photographs, when a thin Englishman with his skin burned red by the sun started to speak. Firm and loud he said, Mr. Mandela, I am a teacher from England. I teach 12-year-olds history. You are my hero, and I have taught my students about you. Can I please be photographed with you? The man took his chance well. Mr. Mandela is surrounded by a wall of bureaucracy. Appointments must be made in advance. Even the press are allowed into his backyard only once a day, and then only for photographs after a meeting. No questions, only photographs. When the Englishman who slipped into the backyard with the press asked so firmly and clearly, a small and uncomfortably little silence settled. Mr. Mandela was the first to react. He suddenly smiled and said, well, now you are my hero. Come here. Somebody took the Englishman's camera to photograph him standing with Mr. Mandela, and the man said, I salute you, Mr. Mandela. It's wonderful to be with you. Then it was over, and the TV cameras turned quickly back to Reverend Hendrick and his men. They could now make their statement. They are fighting with Mr. Mandela, but from within the system, they said, they are overjoyed to have met Mr. Mandela. But the star of the morning was Mr. Michael Turner of Somerset, who was a teacher at the Tidworth Castle Down School. It is close to the famous Stonehenge, says the Englishman, with his short pants, blue shirt and short socks with shoes. He was only in South Africa for a week and is leaving this afternoon for England. The reason for his visit was to trace the footsteps of Sir Francis Drake, something he does in his holidays. The day before yesterday, he was still in Durban. He says, then I realised I can possibly see Mandela if I get to Johannesburg. So I hitchhiked here and came to his house this morning, hoping to get a glimpse of him. Then I can take something back for my pupils. I met Mother Teresa in the same way. I knocked on the door of her convent and I said I am an admirer of her. Then she came out and greeted me, he says, and proudly shows a photograph of him with her. When he left the city, a small group of elderly German tourists were still peering over the wall of the Mandela house, hoping to get a glimpse of the man. There's the irony. And the picture caption is in Afrikaans, which I've not received a translation, but the title of the newspaper report read, Redneck Meets Mandela. And Nelson Mandela, as we heard in the news, received 3,000 requests a month to spend time with him. And here's one of the early ones. He is being interviewed in his back garden. This reminds me just how lucky I was. And ever since then, I've always carried photographs of Nelson Mandela and Mother Teresa with me. And when possible, I show them to classes of children to inspire them to go and see the world, be adventurous, and take unexpected opportunities. I hope you found this edition of Turner's Travels interesting. Thank you.